Revealed, the 18 hidden years of Jesus that the church doesn't want you to know. Have you ever noticed that strange gap in the Bible? The scriptures speak of Jesus as a 12-year-old child in the temple, astounding the elders with his wisdom. Then suddenly, the narrative jumps forward. He reappears at age 30, baptized in the Jordan River, ready to begin his ministry. What happened during those 18 years? Where was the most influential spiritual figure in Western history during the prime of his youth? This isn't just a minor footnote in religious history. It's perhaps the most significant untold story in human spiritual development. Those missing years represent more than half of Jesus' life before his teaching began. A staggering omission for supposedly comprehensive biographies. Think about it. The Bible meticulously chronicles Jesus' birth, the visit of the Magi, his presentation at the temple, and even his family's flight to Egypt. Then we get one story of him at age 12, and nothing until he's 30. Imagine a biography of Einstein that skipped from his childhood directly to his miraculous year of 1905. Wouldn't you wonder what shaped his genius? The question isn't just where Jesus was during this time, but why these chapters of his life were so carefully omitted from the narrative that would become Christianity. Let's start with what the Bible actually tells us. The last we hear of young Jesus is in Luke chapter 2. At 12 years old, Jesus travels with his parents to Jerusalem for Passover. When the festival ends, Mary and Joseph head home, assuming Jesus is somewhere in their traveling group. After a day's journey, they realize he's missing and rush back to Jerusalem in panic. After 3 days, imagine the anguish of those parents. They find him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening and asking questions. Everyone is amazed at his understanding. When his worried mother questions him, Jesus replies with those mysterious words, "Why were you searching for me? Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house?" The passage ends with just one sentence to cover the next 18 years. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. That's it, that's all we get. The traditional explanation is simple. Jesus stayed in Nazareth, learned carpentry from Joseph, and lived a quiet, ordinary life until beginning his ministry. But this explanation feels strangely inadequate for someone who would go on to transform human history. Where did his profound wisdom come from? How did this carpenter's son develop such deep spiritual knowledge that would challenge and ultimately revolutionize religious thought? Some say there's more to the story, much more. In 1887, a Russian explorer and writer named Nicholas Notovich was traveling through the remote Himalayas when he suffered a serious accident. His leg shattered in a fall from his horse. He was carried to the nearest refuge, the ancient Hemis monastery in Ladakh, India. During the 6 weeks it took for his leg to heal, Notovich befriended the chief lama, who eventually revealed something extraordinary. The monastery possessed ancient scrolls mentioning a holy man named Isa, who had come from the West to study with Eastern masters. Isa, according to these texts, was none other than Jesus. The document, titled The Life of Saint Isa, Best of the Sons of Men, told an astonishing story. According to the manuscript, Jesus left Jerusalem at age 13, traveling with merchants along the Silk Road. He first journeyed to India, where he studied with Hindu Brahmins before running into trouble for his criticism of the caste system and his teachings to the untouchables. At age 19, facing threats to his life, Jesus fled to the Himalayas, where he studied Buddhism for 6 years. Finally, at 29, Jesus returned to his homeland to share what he had learned, ultimately meeting his fate on the cross. When Notovich published his findings in 1894 as The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ, he was immediately ridiculed. Skeptics claimed he had fabricated the entire story. The German scholar Max Miller went so far as to write to the monastery, and reportedly received a reply saying no Westerner had visited in the previous 15 years. But here's where it gets interesting. Despite the ridicule, others later visited the same monastery and claimed to have seen the very same manuscript about Isa. In 1922, Swami Abhedananda, a respected Hindu teacher, set out to Hemis specifically to disprove Notovich's lies. To his shock, the monks showed him the same texts Notovich had described. The Swami even translated portions of it himself. A few years later, Nicholas Roerich, a famous Russian artist and explorer funded by the US government, visited the region and not only reported seeing the same manuscript at Hemis, but also documented local legends throughout the Himalayas about Saint Isa, who had come from the West to study their ancient wisdom. Then in 1939, a remarkable confirmation came from two Western women, Elizabeth Kaspari and Gloria Gask, who were shown the texts at Hemis Monastery by the head librarian with these simple words: "These books say your Jesus was here." Could there be truth to this story? If Jesus really did study Eastern spiritual traditions, it might explain some fascinating parallels between his teachings and Eastern philosophy. The concept of loving one's enemies, the emphasis on compassion, the use of parables, the notion of the kingdom within, all these have echoes in Buddhist and Hindu thought that predated Jesus by centuries. Jesus' teaching that the kingdom of heaven is within you resonates deeply with the Upanishadic concept that divine consciousness dwells within each person. His instruction to be as wise as serpents and innocent as doves mirrors Taoist concepts of balancing opposing forces. But many scholars remain skeptical. The original manuscripts have never been photographed or independently authenticated. Some suggest the story might have been a prank by the monks, while others propose it was a conflation of stories about different holy men. Far from the Himalayan mountains, another theory places Jesus in an equally unexpected location: the misty hills of ancient Britain. This tradition centers around Joseph of Arimathea, the wealthy man who, according to the Gospels, provided his own tomb for Jesus' burial. Though the Bible never states this directly, many ancient British traditions hold that Joseph was Jesus' uncle and a tin merchant who traded with the mines of ancient Britain. According to these legends, Joseph brought the young Jesus with him on a trading voyage to Britain. An ancient Cornish rhyme declares, "Joseph was a tin man, and so the miners say, he brought our Lord to England in Uncle Joseph's day." The most famous of these British legends places Jesus in Glastonbury, a town that would later become a center of early British Christianity. The story goes that when Joseph and Jesus arrived in Glastonbury, Joseph placed his walking staff in the ground, where it miraculously took root and blossomed into a thorn tree. This Glastonbury thorn became famous for its unusual blooming pattern, flowering both in spring and around Christmas. Descendants of this tree still exist today, and for centuries, cuttings from it were sent to British monarchs as Christmas decorations. Even more intriguing is the suggestion that while in Britain, Jesus might have studied with the Druids, the learned priest class of ancient Celtic society. While little is known about authentic Druid teachings, as they left no written records, some have pointed to surprising parallels between certain Celtic traditions and Jesus' later teachings. The evidence for Jesus in Britain is largely legendary rather than documentary. Unlike the Isa manuscripts, there are no ancient texts directly stating Jesus visited Britain. However, the persistence of these legends and their embedding in local traditions raises fascinating questions about their origin. William Blake immortalized this tradition in his poem Jerusalem, which became something of an unofficial English anthem. And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green? And was the Holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? If India and Britain seem unlikely destinations for the young Jesus, our next theory is even more startling. In the remote northern Japanese village of Shingo, formerly called Herai, a local tradition holds that Jesus not only visited Japan during his missing years, but eventually returned there after the crucifixion, living to the age of 106. The village maintains what they claim is the tomb of Jesus, marked with a cross and surrounded by a picket fence. Nearby is a second grave said to contain a lock of hair from his mother Mary and an ear from his brother. According to documents allegedly discovered in 1935, though later lost in a fire during World War II, Jesus first came to Japan at age 21 to study theology. He spent 12 years learning from Japanese masters before returning to Judea to attempt to spread what he had learned. The story takes an even more unexpected turn regarding Jesus' crucifixion. According to the Japanese legend, it was not Jesus who died on the cross, but his younger brother Isukiri who voluntarily took his place. Jesus escaped to Japan carrying locks of his mother's hair and his brother's ear as mementos. In Japan, Jesus supposedly changed his name to Torai Taro Daitenku, married a Japanese woman named Miyuko, fathered 3 daughters, and lived as a simple garlic farmer until his death at 106 years of age. While most scholars dismiss this story as pure fantasy, the village of Shingo has embraced it fully. Every year they hold a festival commemorating their connection to Jesus, with traditional Japanese dances performed around his supposed grave. What makes this legend particularly curious are certain cultural anomalies in the region. Until modern times, some locals made marks on babies' foreheads that resembled crosses. Traditional clothing in the area also allegedly bore some resemblance to Middle Eastern rather than Japanese styles. Even the name of the village before it was changed to Shingo, Shirai, bears an uncanny similarity to the Japanese word for Hebrew. And in 2004, the Israeli ambassador to Japan visited Shingo, leaving a letter in Hebrew at Jesus' purported grave. When confronted with these extraordinary theories, it's natural to ask, could any of this possibly be true? Could Jesus really have journeyed to these distant lands during his missing years? From a purely practical perspective, such journeys were certainly possible. The ancient world was more interconnected than many realize. The Silk Road had already been established for centuries, linking the Mediterranean to India and China. Alexandria served as an intellectual crossroads, where Greek, Jewish, Egyptian, and Eastern thought mingled freely. We know with historical certainty that Jesus' disciple Thomas later traveled to India in 52 AD, establishing Christian communities that still exist today. If Thomas could make such a journey just 2 decades after Jesus' crucifixion, why couldn't Jesus himself have done so earlier? There's also a certain logical appeal to these theories. The young Jesus we glimpse in the temple at age 12 is already showing extraordinary wisdom and a thirst for spiritual knowledge. Is it really so far-fetched to imagine that such a person might seek out the wisdom traditions of other cultures? And when Jesus begins his ministry at 30, he arrives with a fully formed spiritual philosophy that in some ways differs significantly from traditional Jewish teaching of his time. His message of universal love, his emphasis on inner transformation rather than rigid observance of law, his use of parables, all these elements have parallels in Eastern spiritual traditions. Yet we must also acknowledge the limitations of the evidence. None of these theories meets the standards historians would typically require to establish historical fact. The Isa manuscripts, if they exist, have never been submitted for scholarly analysis. The British legends emerged centuries after Jesus' time, and the Japanese story has elements that strain credibility to the breaking point. What's particularly strange is the way each culture seems to claim Jesus as their own. The Indian texts portray him as essentially a Buddhist student who returned to Israel to teach Buddha's wisdom. The British traditions connect him to Druid mysticism. The Japanese story makes him a transmitter of Japanese spiritual knowledge. This phenomenon of different cultures appropriating Jesus is itself fascinating, perhaps reflecting a universal desire to connect with his transcendent message. If there's any truth to these alternative narratives about Jesus' missing years, why aren't they part of mainstream Christian understanding? Is there some conspiracy to suppress this information, as some sensationalist accounts suggest? The reality is likely more nuanced. The 4 Gospels that made into the New Testament weren't selected through a sinister plot, but rather emerged as the most reliable and widely accepted accounts among early Christian communities. They were written relatively close to Jesus' lifetime, while many of the alternative texts and traditions emerged much later. The Gospel writers focused primarily on Jesus' ministry, death, and resurrection, may simply not have known much about his earlier life. Mark, the earliest Gospel, doesn't mention Jesus' birth or childhood at all. Matthew and Luke include birth narratives, but little else from his early years. John begins with abstract theology about the Word becoming flesh. By the time the Church began to formalize which texts would be considered authoritative, a process that took centuries, the focus was on preserving what was most central to Christian belief and practice, not on constructing a comprehensive biography. Additionally, the idea that Jesus might have learned from other spiritual traditions could have been theologically problematic for early Christians trying to establish their unique identity amid competing religious claims. A Jesus who synthesized wisdom from multiple sources doesn't fit neatly into the narrative of divine revelation. Modern scholars and church authorities have additional reasons for skepticism. The historical evidence for these alternative narratives falls short of academic standards. Embracing them would mean challenging 2,000 years of traditional understanding based on what many see as flimsy evidence. Yet these stories persist, capturing our imagination precisely because they speak to something we intuitively sense: that spiritual truth transcends cultural boundaries, that wisdom can be found in unexpected places, and that there's something universal in Jesus' message that resonates across traditions. Whether or not Jesus actually traveled to India, Britain, or Japan during his missing years, these stories invite us to consider a more expansive understanding of spiritual truth. What if Jesus did study with Buddhist monks in the Himalayas? What if he did absorb wisdom from the Druids of ancient Britain? What if elements of his teaching were indeed influenced by exposure to multiple spiritual traditions? Such possibilities don't diminish Jesus' significance. They might actually enhance it, showing him as someone who recognized universal spiritual truths across cultural boundaries and synthesized them into a powerful, unified message. These theories challenge us to look beyond narrow cultural and religious divisions. They suggest that wisdom doesn't belong exclusively to any one tradition, but emerges wherever human beings sincerely seek truth. The 18 missing years of Jesus remain one of history's great mysteries. We may never know with certainty what filled that gap between the 12-year-old who amazed the temple elders and the 30-year-old who emerged from the wilderness to change the world. But perhaps the very existence of this gap serves a purpose. It invites us to question, to wonder, and to recognize that some of the most profound spiritual journeys happen in silence, away from public view, in those spaces between the definitive moments of our lives. The traditional narratives tell us that Jesus was divine from birth, inherently possessing all wisdom. But these alternative stories present something perhaps more profound: a Jesus who, like us, sought wisdom, who studied, who learned, who grew, who transformed through encounter with the world's diverse traditions. Such a Jesus might be not less divine, but more deeply human, and in that very humanity, more accessible to all of us on our own quests for meaning and truth. So I leave you with a question. Does it really matter where Jesus was during those 18 years? Or is what matters most the wisdom he ultimately brought into the world? Wisdom that continues to transform lives 2,000 years later, regardless of its origins. Whatever you believe, the missing years of Jesus remind us that even the most influential life contains mysteries. Chapters unwritten, experiences untold, transformations that happen beyond the gaze of history, yet shape everything that follows. Sometimes the most important journeys are the ones that leave no trace in the written record, except in the wisdom they ultimately make possible.